They say justice is blind, but what Grace Delgado learned in that courtroom is that blind doesn't mean fair. It just means someone else gets to decide what you deserve. Her husband's lawyers stood there in their $1,000 suits, smiling like men who already knew the verdict before the judge said a word, while Grace sat with nothing but a folder of papers nobody had bothered to read. She walked out of that courthouse with her name dragged through the record, her savings gone, and one single object clenched in her hand. A small brass key, tossed to her almost as an insult. But that key didn't open a door. It opened a vault, and what was waiting inside would end up costing her ex-husband everything he thought he'd gotten away with. If you believe some people get exactly what's coming to them, eventually stick around. This one earns it. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Grace Delgado had been married to Nathaniel Pierce for 19 years when she found herself standing in a Cook County courtroom listening to a stranger in a robe decide the value of her life. 19 years of raising two kids who were now grown and gone. 19 years of hosting his clients, managing his calendar, smiling through his business dinners while he built a real estate empire that stretched across 4 states. And on paper, according to Nathaniel's attorneys, she had contributed almost nothing to it. The judge read through the settlement terms in a flat, bored voice, the kind of voice reserved for things that had already been decided somewhere else, in some office, before anyone stepped foot in that room. Nathaniel's assets were protected. His development company was structured as a separate entity years before the wedding, or so the paperwork claimed. His properties were held through trusts with names Grace had never heard in 19 years of marriage. The house went to him. The lake house went to him. The Pierce name, which Grace had taken and worn for nearly 2 decades, apparently entitled her to exactly $41,000 and 60 days to vacate. Nathaniel didn't even look at her while the judge spoke. He was checking his phone. When it was over, when the gavel came down on the life she'd built, Grace stood up slowly, gathering the one folder she'd brought, the folder her overwhelmed, underpaid public defender had barely glanced at. Nathaniel's lead attorney, a sharp young woman named Priya Okafor, approached her in the hallway with an envelope. "Mr. Pierce wanted you to have this," Priya said, not quite meeting her eyes. "He said it was only fair, given how things ended." Inside the envelope was a single key, small brass, old, the kind you don't see much anymore, worn smooth at the edges like it had been handled for decades. Taped to it was a note in Nathaniel's handwriting. "Something to remember me by, since you always loved digging through the past." Grace almost laughed. It was such a Nathaniel thing to do, one last cruelty dressed up as generosity, a joke only he found funny. She'd spent years watching him do this to employees, to contractors, to his own brother. Humiliate someone, then hand them a token gesture so he could tell people he'd been gracious about it. She almost threw the key in the nearest trash can outside the courthouse. Her hand actually hovered over the bin, but there was a number etched into the key's head, barely visible under the tarnish. 4471, and below that, 3 faint letters. MSD. Grace had spent 19 years learning how Nathaniel's mind worked, how he never did anything, not one single thing, without a reason buried somewhere underneath it. He didn't hand out mystery keys as jokes. He collected things. He tracked things. If he was giving this to her now, in front of witnesses, timed exactly to the moment she had the least power to ask questions, there was a reason for that, too. She slipped the key in her coat pocket and walked out into the cold with her dog, Biscuit, waiting for her at the curb where a friend had been watching him during the hearing. $41,000. 60 days to leave the house. No job in 19 years that anyone would call relevant. No family left in the city since her mother passed. And an old key with a number that meant nothing to her yet. She had nowhere to go that night except a motel off Route 9, the kind with a flickering sign and thin walls, $29 plus tax. She sat on the edge of the bed with Biscuit curled against her hip and turned the key over and over in her fingers until her thumb ached. MSD. She typed it into her phone along with the number, more out of restlessness than hope. The first result made her sit up straight. Meridian Safe Deposit, a private vault company that had operated out of the old First Union Trust building downtown from 1958 until it quietly closed its doors in 2009, tangled up in some lawsuit nobody remembered anymore. The building had sat empty for over a decade, condemned, tied up in city liens, mentioned once in a local news piece about downtown blight, and forgotten a week later. Grace stared at the screen for a long time. Nathaniel didn't make mistakes with money, and he never gave anything away without knowing exactly what it cost him. If this key belonged to a vault he wanted her to have, wanted her to find, there had to be something in it worth far more than the humiliation of handing it over. Or it was nothing, a dead end, a final joke at her expense. One more way to watch her chase something that led nowhere while he moved on with a woman half his age and twice his good manners. Grace didn't sleep much that night. Somewhere around 3 in the morning, lying in a motel bed that smelled like bleach and old cigarettes, she made a decision that would end up unraveling everything Nathaniel Pierce had spent his life building. In the morning, she was going to find out what 4,471 opened. Grace found the First Union Trust building on foot, since her car had been part of the settlement too, sold off before she'd even known it was on the table. It took her 40 minutes walking from the motel with Biscuit trotting beside her on his leash, past coffee shops and dry cleaners, and a stretch of downtown that had clearly been left behind by whatever recovery the rest of the city had enjoyed. The building itself rose up out of a block of boarded storefronts like something that had been waiting. 6 stories of limestone gone gray with soot, arched windows on the ground floor covered in plywood, a revolving door frozen at an angle that suggested someone had tried to force it open years ago and given up. Above the entrance, carved into the stone, the words First Union Trust and Savings were still legible, though the T had lost a chunk and now read First Union. A chain-link fence ran around the side alley, sagging in one corner where the ground had settled. Grace stood on the sidewalk across the street for a long time, Biscuit sniffing at a fire hydrant, and studied the building like it might tell her something if she looked hard enough. A faded orange sticker on the door read Condemned, dated 3 years earlier, with a city seal half peeled away. She'd expected security. A place like this, sitting on land worth millions in a gentrifying downtown, usually had someone paid to keep people out. But there was nobody. No cameras she could see, no signs of recent maintenance, nothing but pigeons and the kind of silence that only exists in buildings people have stopped thinking about. The sagging spot in the fence was easy enough to pull open. Grace hesitated with her hand on the cold metal, aware that this was trespassing, aware that a 52-year-old woman with a small dog and $41,000 to her name did not have room in her life for a criminal record. But she thought about Priya Okafor's face in that courthouse hallway, not quite meeting her eyes, and she thought about Nathaniel checking his phone while the judge read out the end of her marriage like a grocery list, and she pulled the fence open wide enough to slip through. The side door had been jimmied at some point, the frame splintered, and it swung inward with a groan that echoed longer than it should have. Grace clicked on the flashlight app on her phone and stepped inside, Biscuit's nails clicking against tile that had once been polished marble. The lobby of First Union Trust had been beautiful once. She could see that even now, even coated in years of dust and pigeon droppings and the slow decay of abandonment. Vaulted ceilings with plaster molding, brass teller windows still standing in a row like something out of an old film, a grand staircase curving up to a mezzanine level that had partially collapsed on one side. Water damage streaked down one wall in a long brown scar, and somewhere above her a pipe dripped in a slow, patient rhythm. This was not a place a man like Nathaniel would set foot in. He hated dust, hated disorder, hated anything that didn't come with a doorman and a reservation. That was exactly why the note made sense to her now. Something to remember me by. Since you always loved digging through the past. He knew she wouldn't go. He was counting on it. Grace pushed forward anyway, moving carefully around a section of collapsed ceiling tile, her flashlight beams sweeping across walls stripped of anything valuable long ago by scrappers and scavengers. Whatever remained here wasn't worth stealing on the surface. Copper pipe, maybe if someone hadn't already taken it. She found the vault room on the lower level, down a flight of stairs that groaned under her weight and made Biscuit stop twice, refusing to continue until she picked him up and carried him the rest of the way. The stairwell opened into a windowless room, and there it was, exactly like something from an old heist film. A circular steel door nearly 8 feet tall, dulled with rust, the enormous combination will frozen in place. But this wasn't the vault her key belonged to. This was the main vault, the kind meant for the bank's own reserves. Around its base, embedded into the walls on either side, were rows of smaller doors. Dozens of them, maybe more, brass faceplates gone green with age, each stamped with a 4-digit number. Grace ran her flashlight across the numbers, her heart picking up speed in a way she hadn't felt in years. Not since before the divorce filing, not since before Nathaniel had started sleeping at the office and coming home smelling like someone else's perfume. 4409, 4415, 4422. She found it near the bottom row, close to the floor, small enough that she had to kneel to reach it. 4471. The faceplate was tarnished but intact, the tiny keyhole beneath it clogged with grime that she cleared away with her thumbnail. Her hands were shaking when she pulled the key from her coat pocket. Biscuit sat beside her, ears up, watching the door like he understood something was about to happen. The key slid in smoother than she expected, like it had been waiting. Preparing and narrating the story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Grace turned the key, and somewhere deep inside the mechanism, something old and patient finally released. The small door swung open with a metallic groan, and Grace found herself staring into a space no bigger than a shoebox, dust thick enough that she had to blow across the surface before she could see what was inside. A leather folder, cracked with age. A small velvet pouch, the fabric gone stiff and gray. And underneath both, folded twice, a single sheet of paper with handwriting she didn't recognize, not Nathaniel's clean architect's print, something older, looping and formal, the kind of handwriting people used before typewriters took over everything. She sat back on her heels, biscuit pressing against her leg, and opened the leather folder first. Inside were photographs, black and white, curling at the corners. A man in a suit standing in front of the First Union building when it was still new, the limestone pale and unweathered. Another photo showed the same man shaking hands with someone Grace almost recognized from a framed portrait she'd once seen at Nathaniel's father's house, back when the old man was still alive and Nathaniel still pretended to respect him. The velvet pouch held 3 rings, tarnished silver, the kind of costume jewelry that wouldn't fetch much at a pawn shop but felt heavier with meaning than with metal. And the letter, when Grace finally unfolded it with careful fingers, was addressed to a name she didn't know. Delphine. It was dated 1961. She read it twice before the shape of it settled into her. This vault hadn't been rented by Nathaniel. It had been rented, decades ago, by someone connected to his family, someone whose name showed up nowhere in the Pierce family history Nathaniel loved to recite at dinner parties, the version where his grandfather built an empire from nothing through hard work and vision alone. The letter mentioned money moved quietly, a child sent away, a settlement paid to keep a story from ever surfacing. Grace didn't understand all of it yet, not that night, kneeling on a filthy floor in a condemned bank with her dog and a phone flashlight dying in her hand. But she understood enough to know Nathaniel hadn't given her this key as a joke. He'd given it to her because he didn't know what was in it. He knew the box existed. He knew it had been in the family for generations, forgotten, unclaimed, a loose thread nobody had bothered pulling. And in a moment of pure cruelty, wanting to humiliate her with something worthless, he'd handed her the one object in his possession that might actually matter. Grace sat with that thought for a long time in the dark. Then she packed the folder, the pouch, and the letter back into her bag, and she began to really think about what to do next. She had $41,000 in 60 days before she needed to be out of the house. A motel at $29 a night would burn through that money faster than she could stand to watch. She thought about her sister in Ohio, who'd offered a couch more out of obligation than warmth, the kind of offer you make because you have to, not because you want to. She thought about her old co-workers from the interior design firm she'd left 18 years ago to raise the kids and manage Nathaniel's dinner parties, people who probably didn't remember her name anymore. And she thought about the building around her, 6 stories of empty space that nobody had checked on in years. It was reckless. She knew that. A 52-year-old woman sleeping in a condemned bank was the kind of decision that ended up in a news segment about vulnerable people falling through the cracks, not a decision made by someone with options. But she did the math anyway, sitting there in the vault room with her flashlight dimming. If she paid for a motel, Her money lasted maybe 14 months. If she found a way to live here, quietly, carefully, without anyone noticing, she could stretch that same money into years, long enough to figure out what the letter meant, long enough to decide what to do about it. She spent the next hour exploring the upper floors with Biscuit trotting ahead of her, sniffing every doorway like he was conducting his own inspection. The second floor had been offices once, most of them stripped down to studs and wiring, but one room near the back, what had probably been a manager's office, still had its door intact, still had a window that wasn't boarded, letting in a thin gray wash of streetlight from the alley. The floor was solid. The walls were dry. Someone, at some point, had covered the radiator in plastic sheeting that had somehow kept the dust from settling too badly inside. It wasn't much. A room maybe 14 feet by 12, empty except for an old filing cabinet tipped on its side and a water stain shaped vaguely like Florida on the ceiling. But it had a door that closed. It had 4 solid walls between her and a world that had spent the last 2 days making it very clear she wasn't wanted in it anymore. Grace stood in the middle of that empty room with her dog and her one bag of belongings and felt something she hadn't expected to feel. Not that week, maybe not that year. Not relief exactly. Something closer to resolve. She was not going back to that motel. Not tonight, and maybe not for a long while. Whatever Nathaniel Pierce thought he'd handed her in that courthouse hallway, a worthless key, a final small cruelty dressed up as a gift, he'd been wrong. He was always going to be wrong about her, she realized, standing there in the dark. He'd spent 19 years underestimating what she was capable of when she had nothing left to lose. Grace pulled her coat tighter, sat down against the wall with Biscuit curled into her side, and began planning how she was going to survive in this building long enough to find out exactly what her ex-husband's family had spent 60 years trying to bury. Grace woke the next morning with a stiff back and a cold that had settled into her joints overnight, the kind of cold that came from concrete and old plaster rather than weather. Biscuit was already awake, nose pressed against the gap under the door, tail wagging at some sound only he could hear. Sunlight came through the one unboarded window in thin gray bars, and in that light, the room looked worse than it had the night before. Peeling paint, a dead outlet hanging loose from the wall, a floor gritty with plaster dust that clung to everything. She spent the first morning doing what she'd always done best without ever getting credit for it, taking an ugly, broken situation and figuring out, piece by piece, how to make it work. 19 years of managing Nathaniel's household on a budget he never once asked about, coordinating contractors, tracking expenses down to the dollar, so his business accountant never had a single complaint, had given her a set of skills nobody in that courtroom had bothered to mention. Unemployable, his lawyer had called her. Grace almost laughed thinking about it now, sweeping broken glass into a dustpan with a piece of cardboard because she didn't own a broom yet. She found a laundromat 6 blocks north with a bathroom the owner didn't seem to mind her using, so long as she bought something from the vending machine every so often. A library 4 blocks the other direction had outlets, water fountains, and a librarian named Denise who never once asked why a woman came in every day with a small terrier peeking out of a canvas bag, technically against policy, quietly ignored. Grace spent $60 her second day out, the same amount she used to spend on a single dinner out with Nathaniel's business partners. A battery lantern, a pack of work gloves, a broom, a mop, a bucket, a roll of heavy plastic sheeting to cover the broken window seal. Cleaning supplies strong enough to cut through a decade of grime, but not so strong they'd leave a smell that might draw attention from outside. She learned to time her trips in and out through the side gap in the fence for early morning or late evening, when the block was empty except for the occasional delivery truck rumbling past on its way somewhere else. The manager's office slowly stopped looking like a crime scene and started looking like something closer to a home. She scrubbed the water stain as best she could, though Florida remained faintly visible no matter how hard she worked at it. She found a mattress 2 blocks over, left on a curb with a piece of cardboard reading free, good condition, and dragged it back herself over 3 separate trips, resting every half block, sweating despite the cold. She found a lamp with a cracked shade at a thrift store for $4, rewired the plug herself using a video she watched at the library, a skill she'd picked up years ago helping her father in his garage, back before she married a man who thought fixing things himself was beneath him. Water was the first real problem. She could buy bottled water for a while, but the math didn't work long term, and she refused to let the vault's silent promise slip away because she'd been careless with a $41,000 cushion. She found a working spigot in the building's old boiler room in the basement, connected to pipes that, against every reasonable expectation, still carried city water pressure. It ran brown for the first 10 minutes every time, then cleared. She bought a camping filter from an outdoor supply store and boiled everything twice besides, just to be safe. Electricity was harder. She couldn't risk tapping into anything live, not with wiring that old, and not with the very real possibility that any activated meter would flag someone from the utility company to come investigate. Instead, she built a rotation, the same kind of system she used to run for Nathaniel's household staff, without anyone realizing how much labor went into making his life effortless. Rechargeable battery packs, 6 of them, charged at the library during the day, carried back each evening to power a string of small LED lights she'd strung along the office ceiling. It wasn't bright. It was enough. Within 2 weeks, Grace had built something that no longer felt like hiding. It felt, in its strange, dust-scented way, like building. She found a wingback chair with a torn arm in an alley behind a furniture store that was clearing out old inventory, dragged it in piece by piece with a hand truck she'd bought for $8, patched the tear herself with a needle and thread from a sewing kit she found in the abandoned filing cabinet, left behind by some clerk decades ago and never thrown out. She started reading again, something she hadn't done with any real attention since before the kids were born, back when she used to fall asleep with a paperback open on her chest instead of Nathaniel's schedule running through her head like a second heartbeat. Denise at the library set aside books for her without ever asking questions, sliding them across the counter with a knowing look that Grace appreciated more than she could say. And every few nights, after Biscuit had curled into a spot by the radiator and the building had gone fully silent except for the occasional groan of settling stone, Grace pulled out the leather folder from the vault and read the letter again. Delphine, 1961. A child sent away. A settlement paid to bury a story. She didn't have all the pieces yet, but she was starting to understand that whatever Nathaniel Pierce had built his life on top of, it wasn't quite the foundation he liked to describe at dinner parties. She was going to find out exactly what it was, and she was going to do it from a condemned bank 3 blocks from the courthouse that had just told her she was worth $41,000 and nothing more. 3 weeks into her life inside the First Union building, Grace heard footsteps that weren't hers for the first time since she'd pulled open the gap in the fence. She was sitting in the manager's office with the letters spread across her lap, Biscuit asleep against her hip, when the sound reached her, slow and deliberate, coming from somewhere down on the main floor. Not the settling groan of old stone. Footsteps. A person. She killed the lantern immediately and sat frozen in the dark, one hand pressed flat against Biscuit's back to keep him from barking, her heart slamming hard enough that she could feel it in her throat. The footsteps moved through the lobby, unhurried, and then a beam of light swept up the collapsed mezzanine staircase, pausing on details Grace herself had once studied in that same slow, curious way. Someone who knew buildings. Someone looking for structural damage, not treasure. She thought about running. She thought about the fence gap on the far side of the building, whether she could reach it before whoever this was climbed the stairs and found the one room in this entire condemned structure that had been swept, organized, and quietly, unmistakably lived in. But the footsteps stopped at the base of the stairs, and a voice called up, not sharp, not official sounding, almost tired. "I know somebody's up there." Building inspector doesn't usually get this nervous about noises unless there's a reason. Grace sat in the dark for a long moment, weighing her options, which were not really options at all. Then she stood, opened the door, and stepped out onto the mezzanine landing with her hands visible, the way you do when you've decided honesty is less dangerous than getting caught pretending otherwise. The man below was maybe 60, gray stubble, a city-issued jacket with a patch that read Structural Safety Division, a flashlight in one hand and a clipboard tucked under his arm. He looked up at her without much surprise, like he'd half expected exactly this. "Owen Bassett," he said, not moving closer. "I do the condemned building sweeps for the West District. Every 18 months, whether anybody remembers to fund it properly or not." He tilted his light slightly away from her face, a small courtesy she noticed and appreciated more than she expected to. You planning on hurting anybody, ma'am? Or should I just go back to writing up this water damage on the third floor? I'm not hurting anyone, Grace said. Her voice came out steadier than she felt. I'm not stealing anything either. There's nothing here worth stealing. Owen studied her for a moment, then glanced past her at the door she'd stepped out of, half open, the faint warm glow of a battery lantern visible inside. How long? 3 weeks. He didn't say anything right away. He climbed the stairs slowly, testing each step with his boot before committing his weight, a habit Grace recognized from her own careful movements through this building over the past month. When he reached the landing, he looked past her into the room, taking in the mattress, the patched chair, the small shelf of library books stacked by title, the LED string lights she'd hung with such care along the ceiling. Well, I'll be damned, he said quietly. You cleaned this place up. I didn't have anywhere else to go, Grace said, and hated how small it sounded once it was out in the air between them. Owen was quiet for a long moment, looking at the room, then at her, then down at his clipboard like the answer might be written there. This building's condemned, he said finally. Structurally, it's actually not bad, better than half the places I inspect. City just doesn't want the liability, and there's a lien situation with the old ownership trust that's been tied up in court since before I started this job. Nobody's touching it for years, maybe longer. Are you going to report me? He looked at her for a long moment, and something in his face shifted, some private calculation Grace couldn't quite follow. My mother spent 11 months living out of her car after my father left her with nothing, he said. Judge back then didn't think a 53-year-old homemaker had contributed much to a 30-year marriage either. I know what that math looks like from the outside. It never adds up right. Grace felt something loosen in her chest that she hadn't realized she'd been holding so tightly. I'm required to report safety hazards, Owen continued. You're not one. I'm required to report structural instability. This place is plenty, just not in this room, and not because of anything you did. He clicked his flashlight off. I'm going to write up my report the way I always write it up. Nothing new to note. Thank you, Grace said, and it came out thick, more emotion in it than she'd let herself show anyone since the courtroom. Don't thank me yet, Owen said, and for the first time something almost like humor crossed his face. You've got mice in the west stairwell and a section of ceiling on for that's going to come down eventually. I'll tell you which spots to avoid. He pulled a card from his jacket pocket and held it out. If anybody else from the city shows up, or if something structural worries you, call that number first. It goes to me, not dispatch. Grace took the card, and Biscuit, finally brave enough to leave the doorway, trotted over and sniffed at Owen's boots with the easy confidence of a dog who had decided, on instinct, that this particular stranger was safe. Owen crouched down and scratched behind the dog's ears, unhurried, like he had nowhere else to be. What's his name? Biscuit. Good name. He stood, knees popping audibly in the quiet. I'll be back through in about 6 months for the next sweep. Try to have this place looking even better by then. He turned toward the stairs, then paused halfway down, looking back up at her. Whatever you're dealing with, ma'am, it sounds like you're handling it better than most people would. He disappeared into the dark of the lobby below, and Grace stood on the landing for a long time after his footsteps faded, Biscuit pressed against her leg, the leather folder from the vault still sitting on the chair inside, waiting for her to finish reading what it had to say. Owen's visit changed something in Grace, some small loosening of the fear that had kept her moving through the building like a trespasser in her own life. With that fear quieted, she finally had room to focus fully on the letter, the photographs, the 3 tarnished rings that had sat inside a forgotten vault for over 60 years. She spent her days at the library now with real purpose instead of just killing hours. Sitting at the same corner table near the local history section, Denise bringing her old newspaper archives on microfilm without being asked twice. The name from the letter, Delphine, appeared exactly once in any public record Grace could find, in a birth announcement from 1961. A single line buried in the social pages of a paper that had stopped printing decades ago. Delphine Marsh, daughter of Harriet Marsh, no father listed. It took Grace another 4 days of digging to understand why that mattered. Harriet Marsh had worked as a bookkeeper for Pierce Development Company in its earliest years, back when it was a single man named Walter Pierce running a handful of construction contracts out of a rented office downtown. decades before his grandson Nathaniel would turn the name into an empire spanning 4 states. Grace found Harriet's employment listed in an old city business directory, one line among hundreds, easy to miss unless you already knew what you were looking for. The photographs from the vault started making sense once she laid them out next to what she'd found. The man in the black and white photo standing in front of First Union Trust wasn't a stranger. It was Walter Pierce himself, younger than in the framed portrait at the family estate, but unmistakably the same sharp jaw Nathaniel had inherited along with everything else. And the handshake photo, the one Grace had almost overlooked, showed Walter shaking hands with a bank officer while a young woman stood just behind him in the frame, half turned away from the camera, holding an infant. Grace sat with that photograph for a long time in the quiet of the library, piecing together what the letter had only hinted at. Walter Pierce had fathered a child with his bookkeeper, and rather than let that fact touch the respectable family name he was building his fortune on, he'd paid to make it disappear. The letter she'd found in the vault wasn't from Walter at all. It was from Harriet, addressed to her own daughter, a woman writing down the truth in 1961 because she suspected, correctly, that nobody else ever would. The settlement money, according to the letter, hadn't come from Walter's pocket directly. It had come from company funds, routed through a shell arrangement Harriet herself had helped structure as his bookkeeper, the same skill that had made her valuable enough to keep quiet about in the first place. Grace recognized the pattern instantly, because she'd watched Nathaniel do something almost identical decades later, structuring his own company's earliest contracts through entities that kept his personal assets legally separate from anything a spouse might claim in a divorce. It wasn't just a family secret sitting in that vault. It was the original blueprint. Walter Pierce had built the entire architecture of hiding money and protecting reputation that his grandson would later use against Grace in a courtroom 60 years afterward. And the paper trail proving it, company ledgers referenced by page number in Harriet's own careful handwriting, had been sitting 3 blocks from that same courthouse the whole time. Grace understood, sitting at that library table with Denise, refilling her coffee without a word, that this wasn't really about a decades-old scandal anymore. Pierce Development Company still existed. It was still Nathaniel's company, still structured, according to public filings Grace pulled up on the library computer, around a network of trusts and shell entities that traced back further than anyone at his firm probably realized. If Harriet's ledgers named specific accounts, specific routing structures, specific dates, there was a real chance some of what Walter Pierce built 60 years ago was still active, still buried inside Nathaniel's current holdings, still functioning exactly the way it always had. She thought about the trust documents Priya Okafor had waved around in that courtroom, the ones that supposedly proved Nathaniel's assets predated the marriage and therefore belonged to him alone. Grace had never been allowed to see the underlying structure of those trusts, only the summary her own overwhelmed lawyer had barely had time to review. If those structures traced back to the same architecture Walter had built with Harriet's help, if they used the same offshore routing, the same shell layering, there was a real possibility that Nathaniel's own financial disclosures during the divorce hadn't been entirely honest. Grace didn't have proof of that yet. What she had was a thread, thin but real, connecting a bookkeeper's careful 60-year-old handwriting to a filing cabinet full of company structures Nathaniel had never expected anyone to examine closely enough to notice the family resemblance. She spent the next 2 weeks pulling every public filing she could find on Pierce Development, cross-referencing entity names against the account numbers written in Harriet's letter, filling a second-hand notebook with connections that started slowly to form a pattern too consistent to be coincidence. She wasn't a forensic accountant. She wasn't a lawyer. But she'd spent 19 years managing Nathaniel's household finances well enough that his own accountant never once found a discrepancy. And that same careful attention, turned now toward tearing his structure apart instead of protecting it, was starting to reveal cracks nobody had ever thought to look for. Grace closed her notebook one evening in the library, Biscuit asleep in his canvas bag at her feet, and understood that she was no longer just surviving inside a condemned building. She was building a case, and unlike the one Nathaniel's lawyers had built against her, this one was going to be built entirely on the truth. Grace knew she couldn't walk into a law office with a second-hand notebook full of handwritten connections and expect anyone to take her seriously, not against a firm the size of Pierce Development. Not against lawyers like Priya Okafor, who billed more in an hour than Grace had spent on groceries in a month. She needed something a court couldn't wave away, and she needed to be smart about how she got it. She started with the public filings first, the ones anyone could pull if they knew where to look. Delaware entity registrations, property records, a handful of SEC filings from a brief period when part of Pierce Development had flirted with public investment before Nathaniel's father pulled it back private. Grace spent 3 weeks at the library cross-referencing registered agent addresses, the same handful of law offices showing up again and again behind entities with names that meant nothing on their own. Harbor Crest Holdings, Meridian Capital Partners, names chosen specifically to sound like nothing. The pattern Harriet's letter described 60 years earlier was still there, updated, modernized, but recognizable once Grace knew what to look for. Money moved from Pierce Development's operating accounts into a holding entity, then into a second entity registered in the Caymans, then back into domestic real estate purchases structured to look like fresh capital rather than what it actually was. Grace found 4 properties acquired this way in the last decade alone, each one purchased through an entity that traced back through 3 or 4 layers to the same registered agent Harriet had named in her letter as handling Walter's earliest shell companies. The firm still existed. It had just changed its name twice. What she didn't have was the internal documentation, the actual account numbers and transfer records that would turn a pattern into proof. For that, she needed something more than public filings. She thought about the trust documents from her own divorce, the ones Priya Okafor's team had submitted to the court claiming Nathaniel's assets predated the marriage. Those documents were part of the public court record now, filed with the county clerk's office, technically available to anyone willing to fill out a records request and pay the copying fee. Grace had never thought to ask for them during the proceedings. Too overwhelmed, too poorly represented, too busy just trying to survive the hearing itself. Now she walked into the county clerk's office with $40 in cash and requested the complete case file for Pierce versus Delgado. It took most of a week to go through everything, sitting at the same library table, Denise bringing coffee she'd stopped charging for weeks ago. Buried on page 41 of a financial disclosure exhibit, in a footnote so small it had clearly been designed not to be read closely, was a reference to Harbor Crest Holdings as the entity holding title to the lake house Nathaniel had walked away with. The same entity Grace had already traced back to Walter's original shell structure. It wasn't a smoking gun by itself, but combined with Harriet's letter, the ledger references, and the pattern of transfers Grace had spent weeks documenting, it was enough of a thread that a real attorney, the right kind of attorney, might actually pull on it. She contacted a divorce and financial fraud attorney named Rosalind Cho through an encrypted messaging service, the way she'd read people did when they needed advice without revealing who they were yet. She laid out the situation in general terms first, a hypothetical, the way Grace had learned to frame things after 19 years of watching Nathaniel control every conversation by controlling what got said out loud. If a spouse discovered evidence that assets disclosed as premarital were actually structured through decades-old shell entities still actively used to shield ongoing income, what would that mean for a finalized settlement? Rosalind's answer came back within a day, and it was clear. Fraudulent financial disclosure could reopen a settlement entirely, especially if the shell structure could be shown to have generated income during the marriage itself. Income that should have been part of the marital estate and was intentionally hidden from both Grace and the court. Grace spent 1 more month gathering everything into a single, organized file, thousands of pages photographed and cross-referenced with a precision that would have impressed the accountant who'd once congratulated Nathaniel on never having a single discrepancy in 19 years of returns, never knowing that discrepancy had been avoided entirely because of the woman keeping his books straight from the shadows of his own household. Then she sent it, not anonymously this time, but through Rosalind Cho, filed directly with the court as grounds to reopen Pierce versus Delgado, alongside a separate complaint sent to the State Attorney General's Financial Crimes Division detailing the shell structure's use in shielding taxable income across multiple properties. The response, when it finally came 8 weeks later, arrived the way most consequences do for men like Nathaniel Pierce, quietly at first, then all at once. A local business paper ran a small item about an ongoing state inquiry into Pierce Development's holding structure. Then a larger paper picked it up. Then Nathaniel's company issued a statement calling the allegations baseless, standard boilerplate language that fooled absolutely no one once the State Attorney General's office confirmed an active investigation into shell entities tied to the firm. Grace read about it on the library computer. Denise leaning over her shoulder without pretending not to, and felt something settle in her chest that had been unsettled since the day a stranger in a robe decided her 19 years were worth $41,000. It wasn't triumph exactly. It was closer to balance. Finally, after months of learning to survive in a condemned bank building, finally something tipping back in her direction. The investigation moved faster than Grace expected once the Attorney General's office got involved. Faster than anything involving Nathaniel had ever moved in 19 years of marriage. Subpoenas went out to the registered agent handling Harbor Crest and Meridian Capital. Bank records that had survived 60 years in a forgotten vault turned out to align, almost line for line, with account structures still active today, the same routing patterns, the same layering, updated only in the sense that the numbers had gotten larger. Nathaniel's response followed a pattern Grace could have predicted in her sleep. Denial first, delivered through Priya Okafor at a hastily called press conference, calling the allegations a misunderstanding of standard real estate financing practices. Then delay, motion after motion filed to slow the state subpoenas, each one costing him more in legal fees than the last. Then, once the ledgers from the vault were entered into evidence alongside the current filings, once a forensic accountant hired by the state confirmed that Harbor Crest had generated over $11 million in undisclosed income during the last decade, income that legally should have been part of the marital estate during Grace's divorce, denial stopped being an option. Rosalind Cho called Grace on a Tuesday afternoon. Grace sitting on the wingback chair she'd patched herself, biscuits stretched across her lap in the thin gray light coming through the one unboarded window. "They're settling," Rosalind said. "Pierce Development's board forced Nathaniel out as CEO last week. You probably saw that part already. But the divorce reopening, that's separate, and it's not close. His own attorneys are telling him to settle before this goes to trial, and every filing becomes public record." What does that mean for me? It means the $11 million from Harbor Crest alone should have been part of the marital estate. Add the lake house, add the other 3 properties structured the same way, and we're talking somewhere between $6 and $9 million conservatively. That's before the state finishes tallying the tax fraud numbers, which is a separate matter entirely and not one you need to worry about. Grace sat with the phone against her ear for a long moment, saying nothing, Biscuit's steady breathing the only sound in the room. "Grace? You there?" "I'm here," she said. "I just need a minute." The final settlement, when it came through 3 months later, awarded Grace $7.4 million along with full title to the lake house. The same lake house the original judge had handed to Nathaniel without a second thought, back when Grace's contribution to 19 years of marriage had been valued at $41,000. Nathaniel's personal fortune, after legal fees, back taxes, and the fines levied by the state, dropped to under $2 million, a fraction of what it had been the day he handed Grace the key in a courthouse hallway, thinking he was handing her nothing at all. Grace didn't attend the sentencing hearing when Nathaniel pleaded to reduce tax fraud charges 8 months later, 3 years probation, and a fine that barely registered against what he'd already lost. She read about it in the same local paper that had once run a photograph of him and Talia at a charity gala, back when his name still opened every door in the city. She used some of the settlement money exactly the way she'd planned during those long nights in the manager's office, back when planning was the only thing keeping her warm. She bought the first Union Trust building outright from the city, paying off the old lien that had kept it condemned for over a decade, and hired Owen Bassett as a consultant on the renovation, the only person besides Denise who'd known the truth of what she'd survived inside those walls. The building reopened 18 months later, not as a bank, but as a community resource center, financial literacy classes on the ground floor where the teller windows used to stand, free legal aid clinics on the second floor for people navigating the exact kind of custody and divorce proceedings that had once cost Grace nearly everything. She named the Vault Room, the small space where a rusted door numbered 4471 had once held 60 years of buried truth, the Harriet Marsh Reading Room, filled floor to ceiling with the same second-hand books Denise used to slide across the library counter without a word. Grace kept the manager's office exactly as it had been the night Owen found her there. Mattress in the corner, patched wingback chair, the string of LED lights still hanging from the ceiling where she'd first strung them with shaking hands. She went there sometimes, alone except for Biscuit, when the noise of running a foundation and managing a staff and giving the occasional interview about financial fraud awareness got to be too much. It reminded her of something she never wanted to forget, that the worst thing Nathaniel Pierce ever did to her ended up handing her the exact tool she needed to take everything back. She thought about him rarely now, and when she did, it wasn't with anger. It was with something closer to pity, the particular pity reserved for a man who spent his whole life hiding a truth so carefully that he never once thought to ask what might happen if the wrong person finally found it. He'd meant the key as an insult. He'd handed her a vault instead, and everything that mattered had been locked inside it the entire time, waiting for someone patient enough and hurt enough to finally turn the key. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.